Well, new reports have emerged that the Victorian government only informed DFAT about its controversial Belt and Road Agreement with China on the day it was signed. Joining me live now is Executive Director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, Peter Jennings. He says there is a serious risk of Victorian companies directly contributing to Beijing's debt diplomacy in the Pacific under this particular agreement. He also went a little bit further than that. In fact, what he said was that this particular initiative was flagrantly reckless and undermines a bipartisan Australian foreign policy position. They're strong words, Peter.
Hi, Gleeso. Yes, I guess they are, but it's very rare that you see state governments interfering in Australian foreign policy in such a ham-fisted fashion, and frankly in a way that was willfully blind to receiving the right advice from the federal levels of government and our intelligence services about why Belt and Road is something that state and territory governments should be very careful about. So, this was, I think, a particularly a bad error on the part of the Victorian government, and it will take a little bit of patching up on the part of the federal government, I think, to explain this and to try to, correct misperceptions in Washington, DC and elsewhere.
Well, it seems like US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is not impressed at all. In fact, he told Rowan Dean at the weekend that he thought that it was ludicrous that they would have to reassess their involvement with Australia based on the fact that we were cozying up in Victoria. But yet Daniel Andrews remains very, very stoic on this, Peter, and he's basically saying it's a done deal. I'm not even going to go into the details, which I think is extraordinary, that he's not even prepared to tell the Victorian people or the Australian people what this actually entails.
I agree. I think the idea that democratic governments can keep secrets about the deals they cut with the Chinese Communist Party, that's just astounding, and really it can't be allowed to last. I saw Mike Pompeo's interview as well. Look, I don't think this is going to do damage to the alliance that we have with the United States, but it will damage Victoria's reputation as being a sensible state that businesses could invest in. And we should remember that our largest investor in Australia is not China, it's the United States of America. So, again, on so many levels, I think it's a really bad idea that state governments which are not trained and do not have the intelligence background to deal with international relations, they should really stay out of that and leave it to the federal system.
And Peter, we refer to this as sort of debt diplomacy, certainly in the Pacific. Take us through some of the arrangements that have been struck in and even Sri Lanka. I noticed Sri Lanka has also defaulted on a particular so-called loan to China. What do the Chinese do when nations who are obviously very poor, who rely on these particular handouts, when they don't actually stump up the money or aren't able to repay it back? What does China then actually do?
Well, in the case of Sri Lanka, the Chinese built a huge port at Hambantota, and essentially the Sri Lankan government defaulted on the cost that the Chinese charged them to construct the port, so the Chinese have taken the port over. That's perhaps the worst example in recent years, but there's lots of cases of China under the banner of Belt and Road, building what is termed critical infrastructure through our region. There's a major glossy new airport on the south coast of East Timor now, which I understand Gleeso has about one flight a week constructed by China, all on the aspiration that the Sunrise gas fields would land in that part of Timor. That may never happen now for good economic reasons. And so what you have is disappointed governments on the part of really struggling small developing territories that have engaged with China under the banner of Belt and Road, not really getting much in the way of direct benefit for their own populations, because it's Chinese workers, by the way, that come in to construct these facilities. How that turns into making a dollar for Victorian business, I really don't know. But if I was a business person in Victoria, what I would be doing right now is significantly ramping up the risk factor involved in doing any form of business with China. To me, that would suggest purely on a business case, forget the politics of it, that we're unlikely to see real benefit in Victoria coming from this Belt and Road deal.
Peter, I'll just give you an anecdote on just how powerful the Chinese are. You mentioned that Sri Lankan city. It bid alongside the Gold Coast in 2010 for the 2018 Commonwealth Games. Now, if you looked at both bids, there were light years ahead, the Gold Coast, but because the Chinese backed the bid by the Sri Lankan city, they won by one vote, despite the fact that, there was just no betting on who should have actually won it. And it just goes to show that the bloc that they were able to convince, which was obviously a lot of those Commonwealth nations in Africa, it really rammed home just how powerful the Chinese were. And they wanted that particular Commonwealth Games in 2018 in Sri Lanka. You could imagine how it would have gone down. The Chinese are very hairy-chested at the moment, for want of a better term, Peter. They seem to be picking fights with everyone. What's that all about?
Yes. Well, I think it's actually remarkably short-sighted. Just from a Chinese national interest perspective, I keep thinking to myself that there must be very senior people, smart people inside the Communist Party in China who are thinking, why on earth are we doing this right now? To my way of thinking, Gleeso, I think there's an air of desperation in this. I think what China is desperately trying to do is really to focus the attention of their domestic population on big nationalist issues outside of China, to take attention away from the party's mismanagement of the COVID virus domestically. And, one way to do that is the wag the dog approach, which is you divert everyone's attention to a crisis over Taiwan, or to a fight with Australia, or to a fight with the United States. But as you say, this picking a fight strategy is winning no friends for China anywhere. And I think it's actually turning a large number of governments off the idea of doing business with China, because if the cost of doing business with China is that you're expected to simply tremble and obey every time the party issues a new directive, that's not going to work in Australia. It's not even going to work in Victoria, Gleeso. And I think that, ultimately the people who are really going to suffer as a result of this approach are the Chinese people themselves.
All right, now, if we're going to wean ourselves off this addiction to China, and we see it everywhere, whether it be universities, whether it be in our export trade, what are the countries that we need to look to? I've heard India, I've heard Indonesia. What are the countries we need to look to try and establish really practical trade links if, in fact, we do go down that path and become less exposed to China as time goes by?
Well, the first thing to say is that this is going to be difficult, and it's going to take a few years. You can't easily replace a market of 1.3 billion people. And other countries are in some ways going to be harder and more difficult. But I would be saying we should be doing a full-on press with India now, which is, a successful democracy, a country that respects the rule of law. We have good people-to-people connections. There are many good reasons why Australia should be doing better with India than we really are from a trade sense. Then don't forget 650 million people in Southeast Asia, 240 million of them in Indonesia. That's often been the country that business people have flown over in order to get to those really wonderful markets in North Asia. So we have a big, not just an economic, but a strategic interest in building connections with Indonesia. And then longer term, there's over 1 billion people in Africa, including several hundred million middle-class consumers that would be delighted to receive Australian products. West Australia gets Africa because there's a huge amount of mining and extractive industry involvement from the West. Those of us on the East Coast tend not to think of Africa too much. So, the message is there are alternate markets, but it's going to take effort. And it's going to, be a bit dislocating for businesses that have grown very comfortable, in fact, too comfortable, I'd say, in just doing business with one market. We need to diversify and not put all our eggs in one basket, particularly when you're dealing with, a really unpleasant authoritarian regime, which is what the Chinese Communist Party is.
Well, Peter Jennings, thanks for joining us on Sky News Across Australia. Always great to have you on the show.